I'm a graduate of the University of Waterloo, and this is our practice. So the title is A Meandering Path, it's very meandering, to a Multifaceted Practice. So I'm going like this. Excellent. So that is Alan on the left, and that's myself on the right. So as I mentioned, Alan sends his regrets. He wishes he could be here, but he was unable to do so. I thought I would start from a blast from the past. I believe this is after our first year deadline. A few people in the room, like Rick Andrighetti, actually know where this photograph is taken. It's from the old School of Architecture on main campus, so Environmental Studies 2 on the famous patio. Good luck trying to find me. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of start from here and to think about where I was and where we are now. So during the course of my studies here, I eventually came upon or developed this thesis. My architecture thesis here was called Meditations on Mobility, and I considered the 401 highway as a type of public space. And while upon initial glance, it may not seem to be a type of public space, but I see it as a series of spaces, planned or not, that eventually lend or establish places for people to converge. People have made their own space in these kind of, at times, very inhospitable landscapes. So with that, during my architecture career here as a student, I started to develop ideas about public space, about really considering how design can serve a general public, and maybe that type of public space may not be as conventional or as obvious as one may think it may be. Upon graduation, I worked for the firm Kearns Mancini Architects. Any other Kearns Mancini Architects? Oh, I know they hire from University of Waterloo quite frequently. So I worked there for a number of years. One of the projects I worked on was the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Their master plans. So some of you might be familiar with Queen Street West. This is a project that's been ongoing for over a decade and a half and will take many more years to go. So this is a type of project whose timeline is decades. As someone who's working on this type of project, it's quite challenging to kind of imagine the end, if you will, to imagine that how it will manifest itself and to see, I guess, the satisfaction of seeing our project complete. This is one that has a very significant timeline. Another thing that Kearns Mancini does is, this is kind of the bread and butter of their firm, is they do a lot of Bank of Montreal projects. So whether it be interior fit outs, new constructions, additions, etc. The reason I insert it here is that this is the place where I really cut my teeth into developing the skills of an architect. So I am a licensed architect, and part of the reason I am a licensed architect is because I was able to work on these projects, dozens throughout southwestern Ontario, and really develop a pretty rigorous methodology of functioning as an architect, from project managing to dealing with contractors, dealing with consultants, and all the things in between. So that, you will see as we progress through, has been very valuable in where we see ourselves now as our practice. I'm going to talk a little bit more now about lou-web projects, and I'd like to see a hand of how many people have done, I guess, temporary installations. I'm going to see okay, yeah, I had a feeling there were a number of people here. How many possibly have done so as like a student-led initiative, maybe not necessarily as a function of a course, something for Nuit Blanche maybe, something winter stations maybe? Fantastic. Can I also maybe get one of you to say why you're interested in doing that? Why were you kind of interested in going beyond the School of Architecture here, and what was it that got you to be enthusiastic about that particular endeavor? I'm going to get you two folks at the front, because you're already keen and you're already at the front. Yes. So what were some things that you thought, I want to do this?
I remember the concept being very different from regular Nuit Blanche exhibits at the time, because they weren't creating any additional exhibits, they were using the portable washrooms to make the exhibit. And that's something that's great. Okay,
so maybe a conceptual underpinning or framework that really was compelling. Any other reasons that some other people might have wanted to do this? Okay. I mean, certainly, as you'll see through the course of the presentation, this is something that we specialize in. So we do, we have a multifaceted project, as mentioned earlier, and one of the things I'll start with is our temporary installations. as you can see from our previous experience, or at least my previous experience, I was working on a project such as CAMH, a very long timeline. And I'm also working on Bank of Montreal's, which have like very specific and somewhat rigid kind of design parameters. So the idea of doing an installation beyond those confines, of working on something that's relatively quick, perhaps more playful, not as restrained. So this is where we find ourselves now. So we see design obviously as play. This is our very first project that we did, I guess about 2011 now, the Ballroom of Sounding Light. So this was a project that was done at the Gladstone Hotel in their ballroom for the Come Up to My Room exhibition. And I'm going to try to, figure out the internet, right? Oh, and then did you close these windows?
Don't close my presentation.
I'm not closing your presentation, sorry. Did you close my presentation is the better question. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to show you a brief video of this project, and then I'll tell you some things that we learned about it. Did I hit this? So what you're seeing is a series of balloons, about 60 balloons suspended from the ceiling. Some of them are actually weather balloons that are used for astronomical research. What you're seeing in the foreground there is some custom software that was developed with our colleague Omar Khan, so one of our collaborators. And as you saw earlier, we had another collaborator, his name was Jeff Lee, who was more involved in the software end of things. I think I don't like this interface. Okay. Okay, so I'll bring this to discussions about public space and engagement. For us, it was essentially a design for a party. So what I will do is I'll take you to our first tip for you guys. This is actually one of my favorite projects that we've done. It's our first project together. Our documentation is terrible. That photograph is poor. The video is very poor, which is a huge disservice to ourselves. So for those of you who are interested in this type of work, I would highly recommend that you find someone who would be in charge of the documentation themselves. For us, we thought we could do it. Obviously, I've done photography as part of my thesis here. I feel comfortable doing that. You'll find that in the case of temporary installations, especially the night of or nights of the install or the presentation, you're going to be busy running around, possibly troubleshooting, engaging with people about the piece, etc. So your focus in terms of actually documenting your piece is not so present, and as a result, we actually have very terrible results. Records, I should say, not results. And so, which is actually a great problem for us because you'll see that if you continue to do this sort of practice, the kind of documentation is very important as you present your qualifications for other types of projects. Unfortunately, we can't use this project very frequently because unfortunately it's quite poor. But I should say more what we're interested in this case is we want to have fun. So as I mentioned, we're working a particular line of practice. So we want to create a wonderful night for this party. So in terms of the configuration, we had the DJ in the middle. We had this kind of throbbing lights, red LED lights inside of these balloons. You see the custom software in the foreground there. So we're able to control the what balloon is activated with what relative frequency, how sensitive it is, and how loud it is. But as I mentioned before, it's about this engagement. So really enticing this kind of physical reaction to this simultaneously sonic and visual landscape that we're creating. As we continue on here, so that was kind of design as play. What we see now is we're really interested in design as narrative. And I personally see this as very much a result of our education as architects. So similar to as you all in first year through to your entirety of your career, we do a lot of site analysis whenever we go to a site. So we do our site visits, we do a lot of historic research, we walk around the neighborhoods, we do all that kind of stuff that we do as students, or I personally did as students. So this is another temporary project that we did for Scotiabank Nuit Blanche multiple years ago. It was called Melting Point, and this project was mounted at Fort York National Historic Site. So you can see the Gardiner Expressway in the background, and you can see this one of the two streams of light. So this is a stream of light coming from the two historic cannons. So I'm going to bring up this image here, and then we'll play this video briefly. So a couple of things I'll talk about. As I mentioned, design as narrative. Some of you might be familiar with this. As you hear the cannons or the military fire, Alan's background, he still is an electronic music DJ, and he's very interested in field recordings. So the audio you're hearing is from actual military work that is done occasionally, or reenactments, if you will, that are done at Fort York. So that's some field recordings of that. You're hearing the harp music from a harpist with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, and there's an undercurrent of this water, which is actually Lake Ontario. So what we're doing here is we're bringing forward multiple histories, multiple realities of Fort York National Historic Site. In this case, some of you might know this was actually the foot of Lake Ontario, so we're evoking that history of this kind of water oozing down this particular hill. We have these lights shooting, visually appearing to shoot out of those cannons, so evoking that military history. And also kind of thinking about the spectacle of Nuit Blanche. So as we saw with Ballroom of Sounding Light, this is an audio and light piece. It was up for about a 2-week period. And again, we're interested in this idea of how art can reveal layers of a history. You know, we obviously stood around listening to conversation of people, and some people said, hey, did you know this used to be the front of Lake Ontario? Which was really exciting for us. We see design as like a method of, we see design as being kind of didactic. I don't want to say educational, but certainly we see it as being a valuable vehicle to reveal layers of history. So this is our project, Melting Point. You'll see also that our documentation has gotten much better. So in this case, we hired Nick Kozak, who is a staff photographer at the Toronto Star. So again, I'm not sure if many of you are interested in this particular line of work that we do. One of my tips, obviously, is to do stuff. People often ask us, well, how do we know what to do? One of our resources that we use very frequently It's akimbo.ca is the website. There are listings there constantly for calls for submissions. Some of them range from, conventional gallery shows to temporary installations to permanent public artwork. So if that's something you're interested in, I would highly recommend you go to this site. Also interesting about this site, it's across Canada, the postings. Also interesting are the many exhibitions that are on view in the city of Toronto. There's a very good one that's opening tonight. It's hosted by an organization called Art Spin. They do art exhibitions in unconventional spaces. So this evening, they have an opening for an exhibition in a storage locker facility. So a bunch of the storage lockers will have different installations in them. So this is also part of, as developing a practice, some of my colleagues will mention kind of doing your market research, as it were, familiarizing yourself with the landscape. This is something that we try to do. We try to go out to exhibitions, this idea of like learning all the time beyond the end of one's education here is something that we see as very valuable. Another prong of our practice is this idea of design as engagement. Unfortunately, I think the word engagement is used probably too often in installation work or public artwork, but we see it as very valuable, and I'll talk about it in a particular way. This is a building or a series of models constructed by the architectural firm Marc Boutin Architectural Collective based in Calgary, and they won a competition for the Edmonton Valley Zoo. So their conceptual idea was that they would have a series of pavilions under the themes of below, within, on, and above, as you see through these stunning models. So it's within this context that there was a call for proposals. So we responded to that call for proposals for an artwork on this particular building, which is referred to as the Urban Barn. So this is part of their building now. I mentioned how I see our approach as being inherently architectural. What I mean by that is I think that our foundations are very much based upon a site analysis about responding very much to the particularities of a situation, as that is, I believe, is rooted very much in our education here at Waterloo. So in this case, we spent some time looking at the history of this site. Edmonton Valley Zoo used to be called Storybook Garden, so you can see Humpty Dumpty over there. And so we thought that was kind of a compelling starting point. So as we're starting to develop our ideas, there's a mention earlier about why do you like to do these types of projects, and the comment was said, well, I like to do something that's maybe conceptually more engaging. For us, we do like to we have a lot of fun thinking conceptually about these projects. So in this case, we were intrigued by the idea of a children's pop-up book. The other thing we were intrigued about is, this particular urban barn is meant to be a place where kids can interact with the cows and the chickens, etc. So we thought about this experience of a child who may be familiar with animals simply from a book, but the experience of seeing a cow for the first time is actually kind of scary because they're huge. So it might actually be quite a jarring experience to understand a cow from a flip book this big to seeing a cow this big, several hundred pounds in person. So we think about our artwork as being a kind of, or a segue or as an introduction to that particular piece. So this is the work, it's called Animal Family. And it's mounted onto the reverse side of this same building, the Urban Barn. And what we see, as you can see with the computer rendering here, is that we have a series of panels that flip back and forth similar to a children's flip book. So again, kind of evoking the language that children may be familiar with, the flip book, but scaling it up. So suddenly now we're seeing the animals at life-size scale. So it's hopefully acting as a transition point for children. And then upon seeing this project, then they'll go around the corner and then see the actual barn themselves. So in this case, you'll see upon the flipping of the panels, the tail wagging or a chicken jumping up and down, etc. I mentioned our experience as architects. We see that as very valuable, and we try to we kind of use that as a selling point when we speak with local art communities or clients. We talk about our ability to transition a project from conceptual idea to built reality. So in this case, we're at the manufacturer. The fabricator in this case is a company called Heavy Industries, also based out of Calgary. This is Alan testing out the hinge. He's kind of just rolling or playing on top of that door to make sure it works. So understanding the rigors of public artwork, making sure that it will actually work. Working with the fabricator to develop or source particular hinges that will work in a rigorous environment, thinking through coatings that will work in this sort of environment as well, Edmonton being very cold. So this is the piece under fabrication here. Piece delivered on site. Unfortunately, there is some drama with the installation, so Alan will be heading out again next week to finally see the install of the piece. Oh, so as I say, I've been trying to give you some tips here. So skills learned in architecture offices are applicable to other fields. So as I mentioned, Alan and I developed kind of rigorous ideas or skills being architectural professionals, licensed architects, learning how to execute projects from concept to contract administration, etc. The other thing is Alan and I also worked a lot on expressions of interest, requests for proposals. So that's one of the ways that architectural projects public artwork is procured. There will be maybe postings on Akimbo, for example. We have to present our previous qualifications, so that's where the documentation piece comes in. We have to write a letter of interest, why we're interested in a particular project. And then our experience of working on these documents, some of you as a student may have done this in offices, is really valuable in order to understanding that game. Unfortunately, it is a bit of a game in getting new work. Finally, I'd like to end with design as advocacy. This is something that we derive great satisfaction and joy in doing. So another arm of our practice is that we are both curators. So we curate the exhibition called Grow Up, which is an annual show on ideas of landscape and urbanism and how humans relate to our natural world. Emily Guo, who I think is a recent graduate from the University of Waterloo, won last year a very lucrative prize sponsored by the Toronto Friends of the Visual Arts. She was a participant in the show. So for us, we see design as being very valuable and in this case, I'm going to say tackling the big problems of our world. We try not to shy away from these things. So in this case, you're seeing a cricket farm. So this particular person harvests crickets for consumption as an alternate to higher protein, higher greenhouse gas emitting things such as cows, so the consumption of crickets. We're seeing another, I believe, University of Waterloo graduate, Aisling O'Carroll. So we're seeing a number of projects here so this is a project that's hosted by the Gladstone Hotel. The owner of the Gladstone Hotel, her name is Christina Zeidler. She is a daughter of Eberhard Zeidler, who is the architect of Ontario Place, some notable site within the city of Toronto. So she's the general manager of the show, and she talks about the show as being something that can change the world, and I agree with her. It's kind of engaging artists to consider the big problems that we're seeing, and how can artists engage with these problems. So in addition to the kind of curation piece, we see our architectural background as being influential in terms of the relationship of the pieces within the space to each other. I say within the space because it's mounted within the Gladstone Hotel, a historic building, and the pieces are mounted within public spaces, within rooms. So how do they engage that particular historic site? A valuable piece for us that we think is extremely important is we do a lot of programming associated with the show. So we think a lot about student tours. We want students to see this work. We want students to see how artists are engaging these big ideas and that their perspectives are equally as valid, or that that perhaps they may also be interested in engaging these ideas of global warming, of deforestation, of greenhouse gases from an artistic perspective. So in this case, you're seeing a student tour. Another thing that we like to do as part of our curation is alternative programming. So in addition to student tours, we have food events, we have like a clothing swap. So our goal is really to bring in a broad audience to really think about these ideas from multiple viewpoints because we feel so passionately about this. So this idea of design as advocacy. I'll wrap up now with an invitation to you all, because I think part of the thing is, as I mentioned, do stuff. So this is an invitation for you to do stuff. The call for submissions is out now. It is due October 30th. We'd love to see more proposals from University of Waterloo students. We haven't had that many, Emily Guo and Ashley O'Carroll being a few of the exceptions. The call is out now. We would love to see more proposals. So this year's theme is energy. And that's a pretty intentionally broad topic. We see energy in terms of clean energy, dirty energy, but also these ideas of, say, community energy. How can we as communities engage these ideas of landscape and nature and how we relate to those things in a world that is actually in tough times, I will say. Okay, so this is kind of where we are. This kind of design is narrative, design is engagement, and design is advocacy. We feel greatly enthusiastic about this approach to design and how we can fall within it. Okay, thank you.